So Neil is currently an executive in residence at Trinity Ventures. He's also the co-director at Stanford's Advanced Security program. He was formerly the Chief Information Security Officer at LifeLock and Symantec's Consumer Business Unit. He has also been a security entrepreneur after having left Google in 2008. He co-founded, I don't know if I'm going to butcher this, Dasient,
Good enough, yeah.
which was funded by Google Ventures and got acquired by Twitter. He's passionate about security innovation, and we'll be talking about the biggest breaches and what they mean for the future of security investment. He's also going to be raffling off a couple copies of his The Foundations of Security book that he published back when he was at Google. So with that, I will let Neil speak. And just so you know, after Neil, we also have Joshua Belk from the LA Cyber Lab to present as well.
Thank you for the welcome, everybody, and thank you to the organizers for the invite. I'm going to be talking about some of the biggest breaches on the internet, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the stories behind them, how they happened, and then I'm also going to talk a little bit about what that means for where should we invest money in cybersecurity going forward. There's so many threats, there's so many technologies, there's so many things that one can possibly do, but where should we really put the next set of defenses? Before I get into things a little bit, what I'm going to do is just tell you a little bit about Trinity Ventures, which is where I'm currently an executive in residence. Trinity Ventures is the firm that funded security unicorn Auth0. I don't know how many people heard of Auth0, raise your hand. They were also the funders, by the way, behind Starbucks, behind Jamba Juice, behind Bulletproof in the consumer health and food space. They are also the investors behind New Relic and Aruba Network. So they've had a lot of wins, and I've been working together with them to take a look at a lot of the new cybersecurity companies that are up and coming. I'm also co-director of the Stanford Advanced Security program. I was very glad to see in the audience tonight so many students and so many people who are entering the field of security. When we started the Stanford Advanced Security program about 12 years ago, we felt that there were not enough people coming into the field. And we created this program with the intent of finding people in adjacent fields that had some technical or business chops and teach them what they need to know to get into security. So I'll tell you a little bit more about that at the end. As Andrea mentioned, I'm going to be raffling off a couple copies of a book that I published back when I was at Google called Foundations of Security, and so might as well start off with a little bit of audience participation. Who can tell me what has been the biggest breach on the internet in terms of the number of user accounts or records breached? I need hands. Yahoo, exactly. So I heard people mention Experian, OPM. Yahoo wins out. Yahoo has been the biggest breach on the internet, 3 billion user accounts. I'm going to talk about a little bit of the story behind that, but please come up to collect a copy of your book. And I'm sorry, I didn't catch your name. Richard. So I'm going to first talk about some of the biggest breaches. Then I'm going to chat a little bit about some statistics on cybersecurity companies that have gotten founded and financed over the past 15 years. I'll chat a little bit about the breach landscape. I'll chat about what that means for investment hypotheses going forward, and talk about some trends, and talk about where we can go in the future. So this is, by the way, the first time, I think, while I've given many, many talks in my career, this is the first time that I've given a talk at a holiday party. And so I tried to spice it up with some Christmas images. But as we know, there's many different types of Grinches who turn our worlds into, sometimes a living hell, right? So whether the Grinches are organized cyber criminals, whether they're nation states, today we know that their modus operandi is very different than what it was 15 years ago, where worms and whatnot will be written by amateurs and script kiddies. Today, folks are much more organized about their attacks. Effectively, there's companies working in other countries that are funded by nation states, and they are identifying who do they want to attack, who should they work together with to take them, who are the people in those organizations. And they're very systematic about breaking in. When they break in, they don't just deface a website. They'll get in, they'll stay low and under the radar, and they will conduct their attacks over a period of months or years until they accomplish their goal, whatever that happens to be. So What have been some of the biggest mega breaches? I've got a bunch of them listed on this slide. I think maybe what I'll do is I'll just go through them. You know, back in 2013, the first of the mega breaches occurred when Target got breached. What happened when Target got breached? Well, there were 40+ million credit card numbers stolen. Why was this relevant? Well, it was also the first breach in which the CEO and CISO were fired, the board got sued, there were over 250 million damages. This was unlike the ramifications of any other breach that occurred before. And so one might ask, how did this happen? Well, it turned out Target had a third-party supplier by the name of Fazio Mechanical Services that used to run the heating and air conditioning for all the Target stores. And by the way, Target was not the only retail chain that used that particular company to manage their heating and cooling and make it cost efficient. So basically, the attackers broke into Fazio Mechanical Services. They stole some network credentials. After they stole some network credentials, they were able to then get access to the Target corporate directory. They started stealing contact information, sending out phishing emails with malware-laden links, and one thing led to the next. They basically pivoted until they were able to get into the release management process, whereby one could put code onto all the point-of-sale stations in all of the Target stores. And the attackers were very calculated. They had done this over a period of months, and just before Black Friday, or just on Black Friday, or around that time, back in 2013, is when they turned on their code on those point-of-sale terminals and said, please start sending us all of the credit card numbers. And that's when the breach was noticed. By the way, even prior to this point, Target had a whole bunch of malware defenses. They were, for instance, customers of FireEye. And the FireEye appliances basically were alarming and alerting. And there was a team that they had in India that was forwarding a bunch of those alerts to their US-based team. There was so many alerts and so much noise also that Target was not able to react in time. And that's pretty much how Target got breached. How could it have been prevented? Well, they could have had better network segmentation in between their suppliers and their own networks. They could have reacted better to the malware alerts. There were many things that could have gone right, but it was a pretty well planned out attack. By the way, is there anybody in the audience that has worked at any of these companies? Raise your hand. Just one? Okay, good. By the way, if you have additional details or that you can disclose because they're in some House Majority Report or something post the breach, that you think are relevant, let me know. But I always find it interesting to hear about perspectives. The very next year, JP Morgan Chase got breached. So JP Morgan Chase is one of the nation's most well-known banks. They had invested over $250 million in their security at the time they got breached. You might ask the question, how did JP Morgan Chase, a bank who put so much money into their defenses, how did they get breached? Well, it turned out that they also fell susceptible to breach due to one of their third parties. There had been a JP Morgan Chase employee that got phished. Happens all the time, right? The particular employee that got phished did not report that they got phished to the security team. If they had, one could have reset their password credentials and made them useless, and that could have cut off the attack. But at JP Morgan Chase, they had two-factor authentication deployed almost everywhere. They had two-factor authentication deployed everywhere, or almost everywhere, except at a third-party nonprofit that ran their charitable marathon races for them. So the attackers took the compromised phish credentials, the username and password, and used it at that one particular server to initially get in. And that's the first step in the attackers' breach of JP Morgan Chase. What were the attackers eventually able to steal? They were able to steal 70 million email addresses and customer names. And so the risk there was that when a lot of phishing attacks take place, attackers may not know which bank people have, and when they send out their phishing emails, they may not know what imposter bank to send them to. But if you have effectively their customer list, you know all these people have JP Morgan Chase accounts. You can do a very targeted, a very mass phishing attack. Now, while that was possible, I will say that for a large bank like a JP Morgan Chase, I think it's actually very good that the breach was not any worse than that. You'd think in worse cases, people could have stolen money, transferred funds. None of that happened. It was strictly an email breach. The very next year, Anthem, the very popular healthcare provider, got breached. And how did that particular breach occur? Well, it turns out that they had acquired a company called WellPoint. And the attackers had started sending phishing emails, claiming to be from WellPoint, except instead of L's in the domain names, they were using ones. And a database administrator happened to click on one of those phishing links and entered their username and password. Now, unfortunately, the DBA was using the same password and provided the password for a production database into a website, which you should just never, never do. But after that phishing attack occurred, it wasn't until months later that the security team had noticed that there was a query running on one of Anthem's database servers, and it was querying for the entire 80 million user set. And so the security team asked that particular DBA, hey, is this your query that's running under your name and your credentials? And the DBA said, nope, not my query, breach. That's how the Anthem breach occurred. In the same year, the Office of Personnel Management was breached. For those of you that, some of you have heard of the Office of Personnel Management, but I think prior to this breach, a lot of people had never even heard of the Office of Personnel Management. It happens to be the government agency that keeps all of the personnel records for every government employee, including every CIA agent, every Secret Service agent, every FBI agent. And in this particular case, there was this agency, effectively, they really did not prioritize security as highly as they should have. It's actually unclear how they initially got breached. They did know that in 2014 and early 2015, they had started seeing signs that they were breached, that the attackers were in, and they started taking steps to kick the attackers out of their network. They did effectively what was going to be a big bang. So for any of you that are CISOs or worked in the field, you know that the second that you kick an attacker out of a network, you invalidate a credential, you wipe a machine that they have access to, that gives them immediate feedback that you're onto them. So the worst thing to do is to, when an attacker is in, immediately react and try to kick them out, because chances are when you found them in one place, they're probably in a whole bunch of other places, and you do have to systematically kick them out. So the Office of Personnel Management had a big bang project where they were going to kick out this set of attackers. Now, unfortunately, prior to them executing their big bang to get all the attackers out of the network, there was a second attacker set that came in. And they were so significantly breached that there were a whole bunch of processes running on OPM machines that had file names that effectively were the same file and process names that the McAfee antivirus agent uses, except for the fact that they were not McAfee customers. And those processes were communicating with domains called opmsecurity.org. And of course, this was all meant to mask the attack. But this breach was done by the Chinese, and in the House Oversight Majority Report, it was stated that the impact of this breach is hard to know or hard to ever be known, because effectively in the data that was stolen, the SF-86 forms, it not only contains all the personal information of all the government employees, but when you go apply to work for the Secret Service, I mean, they don't just interview you. They interview everybody in your family, they interview your neighbors, all of those people's social security numbers, addresses, names are all in that data set. And with this data set stolen, effectively, it allows the Chinese to mint spies in the country almost at will. So it's kind of unfortunate that there wasn't a faster reaction. In fact, speed is super critical. In the House report, one of the things that they were criticized for was that they were slow to deploy anti-malware defenses fast enough. They had started deploying Cylance, and as per the report, the second that they turned Cylance on in protection mode, the thing lit up like a Christmas tree. So Richard correctly identified that it was the Yahoo breach. That was the largest breach in the history of the internet. How did the Yahoo breach occur? Who was it conducted by? The Yahoo breach was conducted by 4 Russians. 2 of those Russians were ex-FSB agents. And they had used tools and techniques that were actually not super sophisticated. They're techniques and tools that we all know and use as penetration testers when we go in, right? They used a bunch of spear phishing attacks against Yahoo employees that were known to have access to Yahoo's user database. They started deploying malware within Yahoo. And they were able to compromise Yahoo's user database. Now, one of the things that I thought was particularly interesting about this attack is how did they get to the 3 billion accounts compromised number? And in fact, Yahoo, this breach had started in 2013 and 2014. So if some of you had started to notice that there was spam getting sent out from your Yahoo accounts around that time, it was actually due to this particular breach. Yahoo, however, did not disclose it to the world until 2016. Effectively, from what I believe, the FBI gave Yahoo a call and told them, you've been breached. They had not identified it internally. But one of the things that the attacker had done is not only gotten access to a bunch of data and exfiltrated it, but they got access to Yahoo's source code, and they reverse engineered Yahoo's cookie generation algorithm. So how many people know what a cookie is? Good, most, I'd say maybe half of the room, 2/3. So we all know that when we log into a website, we give them a username and password. That username and password gets checked. After that username and password gets checked, the web server issues the browser a cookie that authenticates the user. And it's that cookie that just keeps going back and forth. And so effectively, if you can figure out how a website generates its cookies, you can pretend to be whoever you want to be on the site. So these Russian attackers did exactly that. They were able to log in at will as whoever they wanted to be. So given their particular goals, they had targeted a few thousand, Russian journalists, diplomats, US politicians. I mean, it was really, really bad news. And it's kind of one of the biggest breaches that was able to happen because of the fact that that cookie generation algorithm got compromised. So, one would think from 2013 to 2016 that, kind of the world would catch on and we'd start deploying all our defenses right away and we'd harden everything. And we've all been working hard to do that. It's just been taking more time than probably we all expected. And who knows, it may take another decade or two. In 2017 and 2018, the breaches continued. I'm not going to talk about each of these breaches in as much depth, but I'm going to highlight just a couple. The Dun & Bradstreet breach from March 2017 I thought was pretty interesting. Dun & Bradstreet is a company that aggregates data about corporations and its employees. And they effectively have a large contact database. And Dun & Bradstreet actually directly did not get breached. Instead, their data set got stolen because of the fact that their business model is they sell that data and that user database to a whole bunch of other companies. So one of the companies that are their customers got breached. And I don't think they even know which one it was. The implication is that we all do a lot to vet the suppliers. And so in the Target breach, they could have perhaps vetted Fazio Mechanical Services better. In the JP Morgan Chase breach, they could have possibly vetted their nonprofit charitable marathons provider. In Dun & Bradstreet's case, because of their business model, it's not just their suppliers that they need to worry about. If you're selling data to customers, what that means is that you probably need to be vetting the security of your customers, because if they get breached, effectively you're breached too. I'll briefly mention the WannaCry breach from 2017. So, we talked about the fact that amateur attackers don't just write worms anymore. And there's been a lot of advancement in antivirus software and anti-malware software. So one might hope that all the worms, the Code Red and the Nimdas and the SQL slammers from the early 2000s, one would hope that that was all gone and we wouldn't have to worry about worms anymore because we have good enough defenses. But there's another saying in our community. The saying is that attacks only get better. And so pretty much WannaCry was an example of a ransomware worm that was developed ostensibly by the North Koreans, where they took a vulnerability, the Blue Eternal vulnerability, and deployed a worm. And so in 2017, 10 to 15 years later, after we fought a lot of worms, we found that worms can still propagate and take advantage of unpatched machines. So I think the important lesson there is that we need to make sure that, given that attacks always get better, they never go away, we need to always be vigilant about all our old defenses in addition to new ones that we deploy. I'll mention Equifax. Equifax was the largest financial identity breach at about 150 million credit histories and whatnot stolen. And the list kind of goes on for 2018. This particular year, Capital One got breached. This is interesting because it was a cloud security breach. And there's a lot of great cloud security companies that are starting. There's a lot of companies that are moving their data to the cloud. And that in itself is not a bad thing. In fact, with a lot of the cloud providers, they can probably invest more in security than any traditional on-premise data center can. So given that, how did this breach in which 100 million SSNs and whatnot get stolen? Well, it turned out that this was a hybrid cloud breach because Capital One had a bunch of on-premise systems. They had a set of cloud systems. They had a particular rule set where there was a web application firewall and there was a misconfiguration. So pretty much the attacker was able to come in from somewhere that was not in the cloud, and this led to this issue. It was also interesting that this particular breach was conducted by somebody that was a former Amazon employee. And in any case, I think that more has to go into looking at the fact that as we're going to be migrating to the cloud for probably still another decade, we're going to have to look in between our on-premise and our cloud and our system. So it's perhaps not enough to just put in cloud-native defenses or on-premise native defenses. We've got to look at holes that can come in between. So anyhow, there's been a lot of breaches, and I think I've talked enough about the bad news. What I want to do is talk about what we can do going forward. So I think one piece of good news is that as all these breaches have occurred, there have been more and more cybersecurity companies getting founded over the past 15 years. In fact, we can see that there is a superlinear growth in the number of cybersecurity companies that are getting founded. This graph shows the financing that goes into the companies. And on one hand, one could say, okay, there's just kind of a good economy. But at the other hand, there's a deep need. what have been some of the largest outcomes in cybersecurity? This slide shows the top IPOs over the past 15 years. CrowdStrike comes in number one. We can see that the biggest outcomes when security companies IPOs come from companies that are next-generation firewalls, that are in the endpoint security space, that are IAM companies. But if we look at the structure of cybersecurity companies, and we look at all the folks that didn't IPO, right, the number of companies, security companies that are publicly held is fairly small. It's about 3% of all of the 4,000 cybersecurity companies that have been funded. Most cybersecurity companies get acquired. Over 2,000 of them have been acquired. And I think back to my own career when I went to my wife back in 2008 and told her, honey, I'm thinking about leaving Google to start a security company. The typical stats are that 90% of new companies fail, and even if you're venture-backed, only 60% of companies succeed and whatnot. But I wish I could have shown her this slide. And in fact, I think for those of you that are considering doing new innovative things, I did want to highlight that the number of cybersecurity companies thus far that have gone out of business is fairly small, at only 205 out of the almost 4,000 companies. There still are about 1,400 that are privately held, but let's say that out of those 1,400, half of those go out of business. Even if that's the case, the failure rates for cybersecurity companies are just so much lower than most other types of companies. Let me just mention that on one of my later slides, I talk about how many people are employed in the cybersecurity field. There's about 1 million people in the US that are employed in the cybersecurity field. Can anyone take a guess as to how many open job positions there are? I'll take a raise of hands. How many open job positions do you think there are in cybersecurity? I'm sorry? 75%. 75% of what? Someone said 1.5 million open cybersecurity positions. 800,000. Who else? 2 billion. 2 million. So what I think is interesting is that there are actually 500,000 open positions. I think it's interesting that everybody here is kind of in the security or auditing field. And from the numbers that you're throwing out there, to an extent, I think we all feel the pain, right? We all feel there should be 800,000 positions or 2 million or whatnot. There's only 500,000, but still, that's a pretty big number. What that means is that for every person that we have in the field today, we need another half a person right away. Due to the skills gap, there is just no way that we'll actually be able to train people fast enough. Even with 500,000 open positions, we'll be able to maybe train enough people to take, 200,000-300,000 of those. Maybe we can automate away 100,000 of those jobs, the most basic ones. But there's a big skills gap. So why is that important here? It's important here because there's such a deep need that if you start a cybersecurity company, and even if you don't hit your target goals, security companies are getting acqui-hired all the time. There are acquisitions, but they're acquisitions mostly for the talent as opposed to for the technology or for the product. And so if you're, and by the way, I've also had the experience of trying to develop new things in larger companies. And to an extent, it's often, you're often able to, and I think there are some large companies where they can innovate internally, and new employees can develop new things fast enough. But for those of you that are a little bit weary, security people and auditing people, they tend to be more risk-averse than others. I want to encourage you to keep this data in mind, and if there's some new innovation you think is worth chasing that can help create an impact for all of the problems that we're fighting, please consider starting a security company. Your stats are pretty good, and there's always acqui-hire as a fallback. So the other reason is that usually the financial outcomes for cybersecurity companies are pretty good. So for those companies that got acquired, if somebody put in, $1 million, median outcome is, 3 million or 9 million on average. So that's quite a spread. Someone puts in $10 million to a security company, average outcomes end up being 300 or 900%. Let me also mention that I've been doing a lot of research and data mining from mainly Crunchbase and PitchBook. I've learned about the pros and cons of the quality of the data on both sides. This data was for about 500 of those acquisitions that actually had the amounts invested and the amounts that they were acquired for. So it's the case that 4 out of 5 of the acquisitions were for more than the amount of money that went into the company. All positive indicators to continue to innovate and create new cybersecurity companies. What have been the top acquisitions? If we look at this slide, we see that Blue Coat, Aruba, Duo, LifeLock, these have been some of the top cybersecurity acquisitions. One thing that's interesting to note from this slide is that if you look at the acquisition prices, a lot of them are more than the market cap for security companies that have IPO'd. So not only is it the case that the outcomes are pretty good in terms of your chances of getting to an exit or getting to an outcome, but amongst the top acquisitions, they end up being more, valuing the companies at more than when they IPO. Who has been doing the acquiring? Well, over the past 15 years, Cisco and Symantec have come out kind of at the top. I think that Cisco, I don't know if anybody here is from Cisco, but I would guess that Cisco is going to continue to be interested in security acquisitions. Symantec just got acquired by Broadcom, or more specifically, the enterprise assets of Symantec got acquired by Broadcom, and the consumer offerings are now under a new company called NortonLifeLock. I think it's unclear if Broadcom is going to be as interested in doing such acquisitions, but there's still a whole host of folks that have spent more than $1 billion on security-related acquisitions. Now, I would also tell folks that, hey, look, when you're building a new company, focus primarily on building a good business. Don't build and run the company with the explicit intent that you think you're going to get acquired. That's actually a recipe for disaster. So you should build a business that has strong fundamentals, but it probably doesn't hurt to package yourself up a little bit to make sure you look very attractive to these set of folks. So that's a little bit about the good news and a lot of innovation that's been occurring through the founding and development of these cybersecurity companies. I do want to chat a little bit about the breach landscape, a couple trends, and then I'll wrap it up. And maybe I'll have some time to take questions. So if we look at the number of breaches by year, by the way, when I read stuff in the press, I kind of am appalled. There's a lot of things in the press that says, well, there's been an exponential increase in the number of breaches per year. I don't know where they're getting that from. And actually, it generally tends to be marketing people. I love marketing, by the way. I love marketing people. But I think it's important to be very data-driven and have the facts behind what you're saying. If we look at the number of breaches that have been taking place over the past 15 years, what we see actually is that there hasn't been an exponential growth in the number of breaches. Rather, if we look at the period from 2004 to 2011, there's not kind of a clear pattern in all of these data points. I've tried fitting all kinds of curves, but what seems to make the when you look at the R-squared statistics for every curve that I tried to fit, it was generally a horrible fit. If you just kind of visually look at it, it seems like up until 2009 to 2011, there's generally been the same number of breaches, but something happened in that time period, and then there's been a significant increase, and it's kind of stayed the same in terms of the number of breaches. In 2009, we all know the Aurora attack occurred, in which Google and 36 other companies had a whole bunch of intellectual property stolen. And one hypothesis is that it was around that time that nation states started getting a lot more aggressive about their attacks. And that could be one explanation for why there's been more breaches since then. At the same time, there hasn't been a growth in breaches. There has been a growth in the number of records that have been getting stolen. And so you look at these data points, and by the way, we all know that Yahoo's the outlier here at 3 billion records breach. But even if you take that one out of the picture, there's still a superlinear curve for the number of records stolen. Now, I've talked to people, and some people think, oh, well, there's more and more data getting created. And yes, we are creating a lot more photos and a lot more videos and all kinds of such data. But the amount of personally identifiable information, for instance, in the US, has generally stayed constant. So what one might potentially gather is that attackers are getting better and better at stealing more and more data, staying in to an organization longer, staying quieter longer, and then getting all out in one shot. If you look at this data, you look at the red bar and you think, okay, hacking or malware must be the top root cause of all of these breaches. But if you look at the physical loss bars and the portable device bars, when physical assets are lost, whether it be on paper or backup tapes or whatever, and when portable devices are lost, why does such activity result in breaches? The reason that they result in breaches is because the data on the lost or stolen devices is unencrypted. And because of the fact that there's people's names and there's unencrypted other types of fields and identifiers, that's what makes them a legally reportable breach that you have to tell a state attorney general about. So actually, if you look at the root causes here, the top root cause of breaches is unencrypted data. So if you're a new CISO going into an organization, first thing you should make sure, get all data encrypted. And you'll end up having dealt with the number one root cause of breaches. The second root cause of breaches is hacking, malware, phishing, as well as these particular causes. And if you look at these root causes, third-party compromise and abuse we talked about, third-party compromise we've talked about, third-party abuse, Facebook fits in there. So Cambridge Analytica abused their third-party access to data. Equifax got compromised because of a Apache Struts vulnerability, software issue, where the attackers could take control of a machine simply by exploiting the vulnerability. If you look at all these root causes and you deal with these root causes, you will have eliminated the overwhelming majority of breaches. So there's a lot of security compliance standards out there, and depending upon what vertical you're in, if you're in the healthcare space, you're working to become HIPAA compliant. If you're taking credit cards, you got to be PCI compliant. If you're in another organization that gets audited, you might have to audit yourself to ISO 20000 or NIST 853. There's a whole bunch of these compliance standards. And there's a lot of different domains in all of them. And there's a lot of controls. But my hypothesis, what I claim and put forward, is that if you address these particular root causes, you will, number one, significantly minimize the probability that you'll get breached. And if you have all the right controls behind these sorts of things, achieving compliance can come out as a side effect. You'll still have to do a whole bunch of other things, but I believe we should set our sights on addressing these root causes as opposed to just achieving compliance. Because actually, if we look at the list of all the companies that got breached, they were all compliant. And of course, the second one of these breaches happens, PCI committee goes in there and says, oh, well, they really couldn't have been compliant. So let's go back and find something where they weren't matching up. But I'd recommend focusing on these root causes and eliminating these, and then achieving compliance as a side effect. I was chatting about the skills gap. Here's the data. This data is from cyberseek.org. We happen to be living in a state where there's a lot of job openings. Since I already talked about this, I'm going to kind of fly through it. The next thing I'm going to talk about is, well, where should we be putting our investment next? Where should we go next? There's been $45 billion that's been invested in cybersecurity companies over the past 15 years. We are clearly not doing as well as a field as we should be. There's a whole bunch of reasons. On our day-to-day jobs, we can all be doing the best we can when we go into work or when we're taking the incident calls or whatnot. But there's definitely a bandwidth issue that needs to be solved. But there is a question also about, what do we need to be focusing on next? What problems have been solved already? What problems do we need to solve going forward? And so what I've done in this next set of slides is I've analyzed, of the $45 billion, how much of that $45 billion has gone into various categories of investment. Let me mention, for instance, that the amount that's been invested in network security has been about $11 billion out of the $45 billion. And that includes not only private equity investments, but when a company goes through an IPO, then that also kind of counts towards it. So from data that I've got from Crunchbase and PitchBook, there is about $10 billion that's gone into blockchain. Blockchain is a very exciting new technology. Blockchain has made the Bitcoin currency possible. One question to ask, though, is that when we think about the fact that network security is a basic, necessary, but not sufficient defense, and we think about the past 15 years, $11 billion gone into that, does it make sense that there's 10 billion, almost 10 billion, that's gone into blockchain? Maybe, maybe not. I would argue maybe not. Does this mean, and when new technologies came out, so somebody that I know as a colleague in the field is Vint Cerf, who co-architected TCP/IP way back when in the 70s, and the protocols on which the internet's built on. And so one question I asked him is that, after you created TCP/IP and created those protocols, when did you start seeing the killer apps? And he was like, I started seeing killer apps right away. I saw email right away. I saw this right away. I saw that right away. I was like, okay, what about the web? The web did take 10 years, but a lot of killer apps started coming out right away. I'm not quite sure we've started seeing a lot of killer apps in blockchain yet. I do think that there is the opportunity for it to improve financial technology and other areas, but perhaps it may make sense to hold off on further investment into blockchain, even though it's cool and exciting, and funnel money into other areas until we start seeing some of the more of the returns come from blockchain. If we look at mobile security, that's an area where just shy of $7 billion have gone in. But if we look at the root causes of all the breaches, how many of those breaches occurred due to a vulnerability on a mobile device? 0 for the mega breaches. And of the 8,000 breaches that privacyrights.org is cataloged, I would guess it's relatively few, right? Or maybe it means that, well, we've done a pretty good job of protecting mobile devices, so maybe we should be putting money somewhere else. Then I did put cryptocurrencies here separately. But in any case, I think you get the idea. One hypothesis is that these are categories that are overinvested. The next category that I'll talk about is cloud security. There's $10 billion that's gone into cloud security, private equity and public IPO. This does not account for the fact that Microsoft and Amazon and Google have made a whole bunch of private investments that are not reflected in this number. Given that network security is at about 11 billion, this is about 10 billion, it doesn't reflect all the investments that the cloud providers have been putting in. This might be a category where there's been sufficient investment. By the way, let me also make the comment that both for these categories as well as cloud security, that doesn't mean that I don't think we should invest further. I think it just means that whatever new initiative has to be doing something really good before we put more money in there. By the way, let me also mention that these are my kind of personal views. These are not the official views of Trinity Ventures or anything. But the super fun question now is, where should we be putting more money? Well, we've talked about the fact that there's a major skills gap. We don't have enough people in cybersecurity. And artificial intelligence and machine learning has the opportunity to help automate away a whole bunch of tasks that humans can do. And so there's about $8 billion that's gone into AI-based type automation, security companies, and I'd argue that maybe worthwhile to put more in there. If I look at areas like security analytics, so as somebody that is a CISO, or has been a CISO in the past, I was kind of surprised that the tech, and by the way, prior to that, my experience was mostly in CTO type jobs. I was kind of surprised that in order to figure out where I should invest next year, just in my own security program, the typical exercise was hire a bunch of consultants, have them interview my staff, and maybe get some data from some of our tools, maybe get some incident data. But I think that there's a lot more that could be done to get lots more technical, data-driven security analytics to figure out where we should be putting the rest of the dough. And I think security analytics, where there's only been $4 billion that's gone in thus far, is an area for further investment. When we look at privacy and fraud detection, both of these areas have something in common. And that is that the amount of pain that's being felt is more than the amount that's been invested. So with privacy, there's $1.5 billion that's gone in. But the last fine that the Federal Trade Commission just issued against Facebook was $5 billion. That one fine is more, 3 times more, than the amount that's been invested in that area over the past 15 years. We've got to put more focus on privacy. Let me also mention, though, that Crunchbase came up with these categories, and so there may be more things that are actually privacy-oriented that are not getting reflected, but even if it's off by a factor of 2, it's still not bad. I think we still need to invest more. Finally, in fraud detection, there's been $1.5 billion that's gone in over the past 15 years. The FBI reports that there's $2.7 billion of fraud a year. So in just 1 year, there's more fraud than the amount of investment that's gone in the past 15 years. So fraud detection is also a good area for further innovation and technology development. Some additional areas, Internet of Things. There's going to be more devices that are going to get connected to the internet over the next 10 years than have been ever connected. And we've seen with the Mirai botnet attack in 2016 that commandeering a few 100,000 of these IoT devices can take down Netflix, Twitter, and Spotify all in one shot. And there's been relatively a small amount that's been invested in that area. I was also, by the way, very surprised to see that only $1.3 billion has gone into risk management types of security companies. So there's only $1.3 billion going in to tell us where the rest of the $45 billion should go. We've got to change that. And I think that, by the way, with risk management, penetration testing, and compliance, one of the challenges is that for venture-type investments, these areas may not seem as cool, but I don't know if that should matter. So I'll just talk about 2 future trends, given that I've talked about where investments have gone thus far and where I think we should be going in the future. So the first trend that I'll talk about is, well, there's actually a whole bunch of interesting trends today. I'm just going to talk about 2. I'm going to talk about misinformation and disinformation campaigns, and I'm going to talk about cyber insurance. So we've seen in the last election that the Russians have been able to have influence on the election. You can debate how much, but basically there were ads shown to 10 million people in the swing states. And the word disinformation actually comes from a Russian word. I can't exactly pronounce the Russian word right, but it's a direct translation. It's like disinformancia or something. We didn't even have a word for it in English. By the way, the Russians have been doing this for years, like decades. We're kind of catching on now. And so I think that if you look at your traditional information security program, misinformation and disinformation campaigns don't appear anywhere. right? You got your GRC group, you got your security incident response group, you've got your security engineering group. Who's fighting disinformation? Disinformation is interesting because it's an area where it matters super a lot to governments, but may or may not matter as much to folks in the private sector. Now, I think there have been attacker groups where disinformation campaigns have been getting conducted against corporate brands with all kinds of incentives. Attackers that want to short stock or whatnot, or influence the brand in some way because there's some foreign interest with regards to that company. And my hope is that private companies start caring a lot more about disinformation so they can become buyers of tools that can help monitor and fight disinformation campaigns. And I'd hope that government agencies could also adopt some of that technology once done. Earlier this year, an organization called the Knight Foundation just invested $50 million and gave grants to a whole bunch of universities. This investment I thought was interesting because if I think back to the late 90s, when the National Science Foundation invested kind of a similar amount in a whole bunch of university projects under digital library initiatives, those were the initiatives out of which Google came. And so one question is, will the next Google that can fight disinformation and misinformation campaigns come out of one of these efforts? Final area I'll talk about is cyber insurance. So we're all required to get car insurance by law. We're all required to get home insurance by the banks because things like fires happen, car accidents happen. And actually, by the way, those events don't happen at the frequency that, say, identity theft occurs. Identity theft occurs to 1 out of every 4 people. Yet, there isn't a corresponding amount of insurance going in to protect. And the way that the cyber insurance field is currently working is if you're, say, a company, you are given a security questionnaire by the insurance company. They ask, are you doing X, Y, and Z? You say yes, yes, yes. You get breached. Then the insurance company goes back and says, oh, actually, maybe you weren't doing X, Y, and Z fully, and so we're not going to pay out, or we're going to pay out less. I think the way that cyber insurance is working today is fairly broken. And I think that there's a lot of room for further innovation in cyber insurance. So there's a lot of opportunities. This is the current landscape of security companies as categorized by a firm by the name of Momentum. It's a super large market. I think that for those of you that are interested in some of the areas I talked about, there's some next steps we can take here. But you know, the hope is that we can have a mission of having no breaches, but I'm unclear as to whether or not that might ever be possible. It might be a nice ideal to shoot for. Good news is the market size of Christmas is bigger than security, so I think we should all realize that, that there are things that are more important. It's of course not growing as fast. So this is a super exciting field to be in. I think that if you're in a leadership position at a company, while there's a lot of vendors out there, I'd encourage you to focus on the root causes. If you're an investor, I'd also encourage you to focus on root causes in areas where there needs to be further investment. I want to give out you know, one final prize here. So who, and it's kind of about the whole disinformation campaigns and whatnot. So who can tell me who is the name of the gentleman in the Democratic National Committee who got phished? John Podesta, that's right. So you get the second book. Your name, sir? Brandon. Brandon, thank you, Brandon. So what happened in 2016 was that the Democratic National Committee was getting attacked by Russia. John Podesta got a phishing email, and the one right thing that he did is he called his IT team. And he said, hey, I got this email. It's telling me I need to reset my Google password. Should I do it? The IT team responded to him and said, yes, we're under attack. Please change your password. And here is the link that you should use, google.com/security. So what John Podesta did is he ignored the fact that the IT team sent him the right link to click on. He went back to the original email, and entered his username and password, and they were not using two-factor authentication, and so the attackers were able to get 60,000 Democratic National Committee emails. So that's how that attack occurred. I want to thank Trinity Ventures and Memo Global Ventures for spending time with me. I wanted to dedicate this talk to Hector Garcia Molina. Hector Garcia Molina was my PhD advisor at Stanford. He passed away about 2 to 3 weeks ago, unfortunately, at the age of 65. He was the principal investigator of the Digital Library Project at Stanford, and he was the guy that was buying Larry and Sergey all their disks. And losing him was just a horrible loss to the world. So dedication out to him. For those of you that are interested in starting a company, interested in investing, please drop me an email at either of these email addresses, at neil@trinityventures or at daswani@cs.stanford.edu. If you're interested in learning more about the field, at the Stanford Advanced Security Program, we have a whole set of courses on emerging threats and defenses. We have courses on cybersecurity and executive strategy, teaches things like how to explain security to your board of directors. We also just rolled out a new Foundations of Security course in which I interviewed Vint Cerf about not only the history of the internet, but the history of security on the internet. And so if you're interested in getting that kind of historical perspective in coming into the field, please check that out. I mentioned some of these courses. Other than that, I hope to meet more people here in the LA community in information security. I have a pretty strong network out in the San Francisco Bay Area. But I just wanted to also thank you for your time and attention. I hope you walked away learning at least a thing or two that you didn't know before. Thank you.